Today, I'd like to welcome you to the first podcast of the COMPAS series of podcasts. And the topic today is on climate justice. And we have several people to discuss the topic, but most importantly, we have two speakers. And the first speaker is Dr. Devon Pena. He's a professor in the Department of Anthropology in the fields of agriculture, environment, and sociocultural anthropology at the University of Washington. He's involved in several participatory action research projects related to the protection of the acequia farming communities of the Upper Rio Grande watershed. This includes continuing work to implement and amplify the 2009 Colorado Acequia Recognition Law. He works as a farmer, seed saver, plant breeder, and philanthropist through his family's nonprofit educational and research foundation, the Acequia Institute. The Institute is located on a 200-acre acequia farm in the San Acacio Bottomlands and on the historic San Luis Peoples Ditch in southern Colorado. He lives and works at the farm during the irrigation to harvest cycle every year and continues with applied projects in restoration ecology, permaculture, shifting mosaics of annual perennial polycultures, and plant breeding and seed saving programs for the conservation of the genomic diversity and integrity of local land race heirloom varieties of the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash in the Upper Rio Grande headwaters bioregion. And Devon has put together a video clip for us today, but I'd also like to introduce you to the respondent, who's Dr. Reynaldo Macias. He is a faculty member and founding chair of the UCLA Cesar Chavez Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies and the Cesar Chavez Center for Interdisciplinary Instruction. He has joint faculty appointments in the Departments of Education and Applied Linguistics. His previous academic appointment was in the UC Santa Barbara Department of Education, during which time he was also the director of the University of California's Linguistic Minority Research Institute between July 1992 and December 1997. The Institute is designed to focus the academic and research resources of the 9 campuses of the University of California on improving the situation of language minorities in the California schools. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 6 books and over 36 research articles and chapters on such topics as bilingual education, teacher supply and demand, Chicanos and schooling, adult literacy, language choice, analyses of national language survey data, population projects, language policies, and media research. So those are our 2 major speakers, but I also wanted to let you know that around the table, we have Raoul Conteras from Indiana University, Northwest, Manuel Hernandez from Arizona State University, Ernesto Mireles from Prescott College, and myself, Karleen Pendleton Jimenez from Trent University. And with that, I would like to go ahead and show you a video clip that Devon has put together to start the discussion.
Mocto, gracias. Thank you for joining us in this podcast that's part of the NACCS Rene Nunez Political Action Committee series for the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. It is my privilege to be here with you this evening from Nuche, Dine, Tewa, and Gemisarequis territory in southern Colorado, San Luis Valley. We are in sacred land. Just to the north of me, my horizon is Isnajini, one of the sacred mountains of the Dine, or Navajo Nation. It is with a great deal of concern shared by the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies and my colleagues at COMPAS that we launched this with a focus on the questions posed not just by climate chaos and the struggle for climate justice, but given the implications also of the COVID-19 pandemic, the widespread fires in California, Oregon, Washington, and across the Intermountain West, all of which I will hope to show you in a moment, are connected to the same processes that are creating climate chaos. There are some principles that I want to make clear that have been articulated by this movement for climate justice. And I also want to point out that this movement grows out of the earlier cycles of struggle by the environmental justice movement with roots in the 1980s and struggles against toxic waste and race. The climate crisis, the first principle states, is a consequence of the metabolic and societal disorders that are associated with settler colonialism and capitalism. All our relations are dying in the shadows of the Capitolocene. You've heard the term Anthropocene. That blames all of humanity, but not every human being is destructive in their relationship to the environment in the manner that capitalist corporations, settler colonial nation states, and other powers that are acting on a global scale are capable of doing. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, including Chicanekis, populations are already suffering disproportionate impacts and effects from global processes of environmental violence. And it's very important to see environmental violence as a form of structural violence that is unleashed specifically under the conditions of neoliberal globalization, deregulation, corporate control, a market fundamentalist approach of the regime that is in fact augmenting the effects of what Marx called the second contradiction of capitalism, which is to say the tendency for capitalism to destroy the very natural social, cultural, and ecological conditions of its own existence. The third principle is that, therefore, climate chaos is not just about human cost problems. It's not anthropogenic. It is a problem of capitalism. It is driven by the destruction of the planet's life support systems under the dominant settler colonial formations that serve globalizing capitalist, social, and market forces. In other words, climate chaos is not just a function of the old ruse about overpopulation or underdevelopment, too many poor people, destroying the environment and setting fires. For example, 99% of the fires that are caused in the Amazon, in Indonesia, in Borneo, and other places in Mexico are caused by corporations seeking to drive indigenous people out. So the whole mythology about little brown people destroying the planet and causing climate change is a capitalist settler colonial myth. We must recognize that capitalism and settler colonialism are the precise problem. And then finally, and this is actually the most important principle of the climate justice movement, I take it from Clifford Leo Jr., an Aboriginal from Canada who's written very profound work on this question. And he puts it in very simple terms: there is no indigenizing capitalism. There is no way to make capitalism compatible with something the Zapatistas taught us a long time ago when they launched their revolt against NAFTA and neoliberal capitalism in Mexico. What did they say? Everything is for sale except for indigenous dignity. The dignity to be able to eat your own traditional, safe, healthy, fresh foods. The dignity to be able to farm the way your ancestors have, to care for the seeds and the plants that are vital to your sense of being, your well-being, and community health. The dignity of being able to drink clean water and breathe clean air. The dignity of being able to have access to all the healthcare and all the education is dictated by your own community-based knowledge requires. The dignity to be treated in the manner that recognizes that ecosystems have a right to dignity as well. And so this is a very profound indictment of the capitalist settler colonial system that we are proposing in this crisis statement, but it would be wrong for us to focus only on the problems. So after outlining the key problems that we're addressing in this climate crisis statement, I want to get to solutions. What are we demanding? And more importantly, what are we doing already? First of all, we need to challenge the idea that what we're facing is simple climate change. The climate has changed well before humans were on the planet, and it will change long after we are gone. It's chaos that's happening. The unpredictability, the disruptions that one year here, you see back here is my cornfield from this season. Some years there's no water, other years there's plenty of water. This year, the snow hit 2 weeks early. Last year, the season lasted 2 weeks longer than normal. It's chaos, it's unpredictable. There's no way to predict what's going to happen. And this creates cumulative effects that the scientific community is only starting to recognize and understand. But it does create great dislocation, displacement, and hardship, not just for land-based peoples, but as you will see in a moment, for people in the cities as well. Climate chaos is destroying the natural systems that we depend on to produce our food, our medicine, our clothing, and our shelter. We are facing a crisis already in which native indigenous communities from the Arctic like at Kivalina to the Andes and the Pacific Rim Island nations, are already being devastated by the chaos of climate change. It's not a future effect, it is in fact an effect of the past couple of decades, if not longer. We're also facing a crisis in which Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and low-income persons and the elderly are already being killed or displaced by the effects of climate change and chaos. This leads us to a very necessary evaluation, as always been the case with the environmental justice movement, of looking at disparate impacts. There's evidence of these disparate impacts, and we have to weigh this in order to consider our own political options and strategies. There are urban heat islands. For example, research confirms that African Americans in the United States are 52% more likely to live in urban heat islands compared to whites. The same is the case for Asian Americans, who are 32% more likely, and for Latinos, Latinas, and Latinx people, who are 21% more likely. By an urban heat island, we mean a neighborhood that is 5 to 10 degrees hotter than the rest of the city. This has to do, of course, with gentrification, segregation, the lack of open space and green spaces in BIPOC communities. And it is extremely problematic because there are neighborhoods, for example, in Phoenix in 2017, in the neighborhood of Guadalupe, which is a predominantly Native American Tohono O'odham neighborhood, 155 people died during the heat wave. So this impact of urban heat islands is disproportionately affecting BIPOC and low-income communities. We are also more vulnerable to extreme cold weather and mortality from the effects of extreme cold weather events. This is certainly the case in rural communities and on Native American reservations that have faced a shortage of access to heating supplies, whether it's wood or gas or propane or electric. These are basically rural colonias that are underserved and lack the infrastructure to protect their elderly and ill and low-income populations from extreme cold. Of course, there are disparate impacts on farm and natural resource and other food chain workers, especially because they are vulnerable under the current conditions of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. They're threatened by heat waves, fires, the pandemic conditions that are exacerbated by climate chaos. So that farm workers, for ejemplo, in California, face not only the smoke and smoke-related illness and asthma attacks that they'll have from working in the fields during these fires, but that will make them even more vulnerable to COVID-19. And then that's exacerbated by a lack of access to healthcare and to adequate nutrition. So the hands that feed us, that send food from the farm to the table, themselves cannot eat correctly because of these forms of structural violence. All this is interrelated, and it's part of the structural racism that is affecting us and our communities through these disparate impacts. There are also climate refugees that are suffering disparate impacts. Many of these folks are here because of the so-called dirty wars in Central America, for example. All the murderous regimes that were supported by US foreign policy, the militarization and neoliberalization of Central America and Mexico is precisely what's led to this diaspora of mostly indigenous people who are no longer able to farm on their land because they have no water, or because they're being driven out by corporate farms, or by drug dealers and drug cartels. And it is also important to note that these are the very same people, the very same families that are having their children put inside cages as the families are separated under the current fascist regime. So all this, again, is interconnected. We also have the displacement of cultures of habitat. And by this I mean is that indigenous peoples have long been recognized for their deep traditions of resilient co-inhabitation of environments. Indigenous peoples tend not to degrade their environments. In fact, their homelands tend to be the most important hotspots of biological diversity across the planet. That's not an accident. It is not a coincidence. It is a direct result of multi-generational transmission of traditional environmental knowledge about how to co-inhabit place without impoverishing the environment that is your home, that is, without destroying your mother. These cultures of habitat are being displaced by all of the above, and of course, narco drug cartels, as well as military actions and military foreign policy on the part of the United States are primary forces alongside things like the Plan Panama, as they used to call it, the building of massive infrastructure, El Tren Maya, that AMLO unfortunately has decided to continue using or planning to build, despite the large-scale, massive opposition to it on the part of the indigenous communities of Mexico that would be affected by the Tren Maya. So that's an additional threat that we've known about all along. These are all consequences of continued governance of Mexico by settler colonialism. Finally, we have food system and food sovereignty impacts that we need to address. It's really important, and this is where I see a lot of promise, because a lot of us this summer, ever since COVID-19 appeared on the scene, and all of us who are farmers and producing food and food waste have mobilized our communities in order to feed those who don't have access to food. And moreover, to help them build a capacity to produce their own food. The food sovereignty movement connects all the dots. We can farm in a way that is part of carbon sequestration. We can farm in a way that restores the health of our people by restoring traditional cuisine. We need to restore traditional foodways, our traditional indigenous agroecosystems, all of which are part of millenary food justice and agricultural regenerative practices. Air quality is a big issue as well. We need to recognize that as far back as 1987, with respect to both air and water quality, 1987, the United Church of Christ Racial Commission on Racial Justice, published the famous Toxic Waste and Waste Report. That 1987 report was done 20 years later, again in 2007. And in both cases, there was no improvement actually over that period of 20 years. It was found that Mexican origin communities are drinking the most polluted water alongside African American and Native American communities. This is no surprise. We're exposed to lead in our water. Flint is just the tip of the iceberg. And this is a problem that has been known for decades, actually, because it is a widespread problem among BIPOC communities. And so access to water, let alone the issue of quality, is also an important issue. We find that more than 1.8 billion people planet-wide will be suffering from water stress conditions. By 2017, this was the case. By 2021, we're now predicting that it'll be over 2 billion people facing extreme water stress. Who do you think that'll be? It'll be people of color and indigenous people all over the planet, including inside US, Mexico, Canada, and other parts of Abya Yala. What are our demands? Well, first of all, we are so proud of and inspired by the youth who have led the climate strike actions across the United States. These actions continue. I want to point out that it's not just Greta. I mean, Greta is fantastic and a good accomplice, but I'm thinking here of Chutescot Martinez and all the other youth who filed the lawsuit in Juliana versus the United States. We need to remember that BIPOC youth have led the climate justice movement longer than any other group. And we need to continue supporting their activism, educating our youth and empowering them to have the resources they need to establish this as a permanent struggle until we win. We also call on United States universities and colleges to divest themselves of stocks in fossil fuel and other extractive industries that are the principal drivers of all this environmental violence. We further call on higher education institutions to end their participation in global land grabs, the stealing of land across the global south, from Mexico to Ghana to Zimbabwe, you name it, Botswana. These universities, including Harvard and Texas, are buying land up like crazy across the global south. Indigenous people of their ancestral lands, and it robs the world as a whole of the loss of these sustainable, resilient, and equitable cultures of habitat that are protecting the planet. So not only are we destroying cultures, we're destroying the very cultures that are helping to protect the planet and that point us in the direction of a more resilient, equitable, and sustainable future. We also resolved that the Green New Deal is an essential tool for education and encouraging civic engagement among our students and faculty, and especially call on the shapers of this initiative in Congress to include community-based and grassroots-led projects for ecological restoration of our wounded watersheds and ecosystems, both in urban and rural areas. We also call for legal recognition of access to safe water and culturally appropriate food as basic universal human rights. We also find and must emphasize this point because land acknowledgement, like what I did at the opening, without relational solidarity on the ground is performative allyship. We need to avoid just performing being good allies. We need to be good allies on the ground, be accomplices in the struggles for reparations to indigenous and other land and water-based communities in the US and across the world. The primary reparations must involve investments to return native lands to rightful indigenous caregiver heirs and to heal the colonial wounds that are suffered by the land, water, air, and people. This should be an underlying principle of the Green New Deal. Finally, when we wrote this crisis statement, Gabriel Valle and myself, when we were invited to do so by the NACCS board back in October of last year, and I believe we submitted and published in November of last year, COVID-19 had not appeared on the scene yet. As a result of that, I've taken the liberty of writing these next few words with respect to our demands that I believe are consistent with the rest of the statement. We recognize that the current COVID-19 pandemic is a direct metabolic disorder caused by the very same capitalist practices that are leading to climate chaos. We recognize that the disparate impact of the pandemic on Black and brown bodies and communities results from the embedded structural and racialized violence that denies us access to healthcare while forcing us to live, work, play, and pray in contaminated, higher risk environments. We therefore call on the uses of education and civic engagement by our students and teachers to actively engage in struggles to promote a better understanding of healthcare as a universal human right and to end the kind of racism that has defined the demographics of the pandemic. I wanted to invite you all to reflect on these ideas that we've presented through the NACCS statement on the climate crisis. But I think the most important thing I would ask for everyone to reflect on is the need for us to be action-oriented, is to have a praxis, is to have a daily participation, not as an individual. That's the wrong question, and that's what the Zapatistas would tell you. You know, if you're going to do mandar obedecer, if you're going to lead by obeying, you're obeying the collective will of a movement, not of an individual desire. Individual action is pointless. What we need is to grow a mass-based social movement and support those movements that are developing a struggle that intersects with the philosophical and practical and, in fact, indigenous desires of our communities. Mocto, gracias, stay well. Well, there you have the presentation I did on the NACCS statement on the
Gracias.
Climate crisis.
Okay, my response is not one of traditional criticism of an academic presentation. It's within the framework of the purpose of COMPAS as a policy, political analysis, positioning unit within NACCS. And so there are a couple of issues that I will address with regards to the statement and the addendum that Devon has added or shared with us that relates to really public health, but framed within the current COVID-19 pandemic or SARS-2. The two questions that I'm going to raise with regards to the presentation focus both on the original statement and the addendum. Okay, so I'm going to take it as a whole. The first question is whether Chicana and Chicano studies. And that is, where is there a particular Chicanao perspective with regards to what has been framed as the climate crisis, climate justice, environmental crisis, environmental justice. And I think that there are a number of things that have to go within that. The other has to do with the framework that we are dealing with in this in relationship to Chicana and Chicano studies. And that is the cultural differences as opposed to the racial differences as a frame for looking at the whole area of climate crisis or environmental crisis and justice. And why do I put that there? It's within the framework of Chicana and Chicano studies that that I raise this issue, because it is a particularly important or salient one for how we deal with not only political positions, but policy alternatives in relationship to different kinds of issues. And so I just want to very quickly lay out three things. What's Chicana and Chicano studies? It's primarily the study of the Indo-Mestizo, Mulatto, Hispano population, the taproot of which is indigenous. And so it's a multiple subjectivity of the Mexican population with, if you want, a small m that covers any number of groups. And so the focus is on the diversity of the group and the range of variations within the group. And then secondly, you know, what's the nature of the questions that in large part we address within Chicana and Chicano studies? It's who are we, what's our material situation in the world, and what do we do about it? And we've learned from the kind of research that has been done in the past and that is still being done that Chicana and Chicano studies scholarship should at least include historicized, contextualized, politicized, that is dealing with power, and indigenized frameworks in order to avoid the kinds of biases, flaws, and fatal flaws of Western-centric positivistic research that leads more to stereotypes, incomplete study, and a number of other kinds of things, which gets us into what are the big ideas that we have to deal with, particularly in analyzing what our material situation in the world is. And that has to be race, culture, sex, gender, and sexuality, and class and political economy. So the idea that we're going to prioritize one of these over another has been part of the discussion or debates over theoretically embraced scholars that say, no, you know, class is the primary consideration, or race is the primary consideration, or sex is the primary consideration, or sexuality is the primary consideration that drives everything else. But within Chicana and Chicano studies, taken as a whole, we have to deal with each of these four big ideas, because that's the way that much of the society, particularly in the US, but more broadly, is organized along these four dimensions or axes, but also power is distributed along these four powers and dimensions. So if we're going to be dealing with that, particularly from a political or policy standpoint, we have to take into account all of those kinds of things. So in both the presentation that was written and adopted by the NACCS board, what is it, 2 years ago, I guess, and then the addendum that we were just shared, then my concern is where's the cultural element? And by cultural element, I don't mean just the indigenous approach, but what is the indigenous approach and how does it relate then to Chicana and Chicano studies in terms of a NACCS positioning, both in terms of analysis and in terms of alternatives to this. And that's where I think we really could benefit from a discussion of these two questions that addresses then our interactions with other groups and with policies and politics. Let me take a couple of quick examples related to the presentation, where the notion of capitalism and colonialism, you mentioned settler colonialism, is most particularly presented here. It's really in relationship to the extractive economic activities of both, and they're not the same in that respect. But there are similarities and there are differences and there are changes over 500 years. So the question is in part, what are those and how do they change and how do they affect the local as well as the indigenous, the local areas, the indigenous populations, but also the multiple processes. Now, when we talk about, Black and brown or, BIPOC, as you put it, which is generally referred to as Black and indigenous peoples of color, it concerns me that we are prioritizing race as opposed to the distinctiveness of culture in relationship to our people. And what that means is that while indigenous is put there, it's from a color standpoint in US discussion, indigenous people are American Indian and are red, but Mexicans are, in the general policy political framed as immigrants, and brown. But there's always this underlying question of, well, are we really brown because it's a lot of us are quote white as opposed to moreno or prieto, much less Indian, and so on. And so it becomes a matter of putting the Mexican population, el milagro mexicano, in terms of race and color and features and a whole lot of other things into the color framework of the US, which is even within the Black community, if you're white, you're right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're Black, stand back. Okay, and it is a process that distorts the messaging of una perspectiva chicana within these political processes. And so the idea of the relationship of Chicana and Chicano studies as an indigenous, and we get back into this discussion epistemologically that Roberto Rodriguez had raised a number of years ago when we were developing the Indigenous Caucus within NACCS, is Chicana and Chicano studies a wing of Indigenous studies, or is Indigenous studies a wing of Chicana and Chicano studies? And I'm not sure that we have to answer that question in terms of dealing with this relationship, but how we deal with the relationship is important in terms of dealing with our political analysis. Because if we're not seeing ourselves as an indigenous group, or a predominantly indigenous group, then the issues that you raise, Devon, in the statement and in the addendum, particularly related to agriculture and farming, and being water protectors and so on, then really get covered up in terms of our positioning to be able to speak about it, you know, as opposed to supporting another group in relationship to it. And it seems to me that the work that you've been doing in the Acequia is really belies, you know, that framework of looking at indigeneity as another group. And that's where I think the answer to where is Chicana and Chicano studies in relationship to all of this really becomes important. The recent discussion of the fires in California, and particularly them being fire complexes, and the critique from the Trump administration that the reason that they're so bad is because of California's fire management, as opposed to environmental changes that are taking place, was discussed in an article in the LA Times not too long ago that said if we look at Mexican forest management, we'll see a very different process that allows for less intense fires and less fire spread than we see in California.
If I may just
so I'm just kind of using this as an example. So the idea of where Chicana and Chicano studies fits into to say, well, you know, that example is okay, but it's not really a good one. Or, you know, if the idea is good, it's because of these principles with regards to how you relate to and manage all life, including trees and bushes and plants and so on. And so it seems to me that the voice of Chicana and Chicano studies, or the voices of Chicana and Chicano studies, are still not being heard when we discuss it or present it in relationship to the kind of political Western-centric approach to environment, to climate, and so on. So those are the kinds of things that that I would like to see, and especially along the lines of the four demands, you know, youth involvement, you know, and mentioning, you know, Northwestern European leadership and BIPOC leadership, but not Chicano leadership, and in particular the kind of work that you are doing seems to me to beg the question then of what do we base our position on? Stop stealing the land, you know, tremendously, but it's more than that. It's the whole basis of private property in terms of that stealing of the land that ignores the notion of not public property but social property that is collectively organized and dealt with in terms of a self-sufficiency of community, which leads us then to the issue of urban heat plates, because much of that heat is because of the amount of cement, asphalt, and other covering of the earth that has taken place that reflects the heat in ways that that really needs to be taken into account. So what is the urban planning position of Chicana and Chicano studies relative to that, you know? So, you know, and the same thing with the Green New Deal and the relationship to health and zoological transfer of viruses from bats, pigs, other animals to humans, which has a much longer tradition within European populations than it did in other populations in the world. And the spread of capitalist framework of of economic relations has put us as a world human community at risk for this. So, you know, the idea of what, you know, our Chicano studies perspectives with regards to health, then it seems to me are particularly important. Not just the differential impact on Black and brown bodies, but on the whole idea of its impact on humans. And if there is environmental or climate change that takes place because it's a dynamic, organic earth and system, then what's the human contribution to that, particularly in relationship to violence, and not just a question of what the impact is in terms of the inequalities that have been addressed in terms of violence against people of color or the poor or others as a result of these economic systems. Anyway, in some ways that's a lot, but it seems to me that given the broad framework of in effect a positioning on a world issue, that we have to, you know, take into account then what is the contribution that NACCS and, you know, and this particular caucus can provide. So that would be my contribution.
I agradezco mucho, Professor, every word that you shared with us. Before I invite Raoul and Manuel to chime in, I would like a chance to respond to some of the things you said. One of the first things I wanted to respond to is what Trump said about the fires in California, because it gives me a chance to illustrate some of the points you're asking us to make. Now, this was a 2-page statement, so we couldn't get into the elaboration of all the issues, but I'm certainly sympathetic to everything you said. The California fires happen on federal lands. So it's actually the responsibility of the federal government to manage most of those lands because they're either BLM or Forest Service lands or national park lands. Very little of state lands are involved in this, which is not to say that California has done a good job with those either. They have not. Why? Because they've ignored Ohlone wisdom. I have a colleague, M.Cat Anderson, who's for 30 years has been studying the fire ecology of the Ohlone native people of California. The oak savanna was intensely managed by them for hundreds, even thousands of years as an ecosystem with frequent low intensity fire. And instead, Smokey the Bear, a racist Smokey the Bear shows up, and what do you get? Fire suppression, not just in California, but on all public lands. So the racist Smokey the Bear prevents indigenous people from harvesting dead timber for fire or for construction materials. They suppress fire and end up building up the fuel load of these forests over a period of more than 100 years. And the first warning sign was when Yellowstone blew up. In 1987, I believe, was the Yellowstone fire. You recall that, Reynaldo? And that was the beginning of these frequent high intensity fires they're called stand replacement fires. And they replace the whole stand, and they can actually prevent the regeneration of the forest because the fire is so hot that it kills the aspen roots that are waiting in our bioregion to come as successional species whenever you have frequent low intensity fire. So I really do appreciate that you brought that up because it illustrates again how both Mexican and Ohlone people practice low intensity fire as part of their management. It opened up here in San Luis. People will still tell stories about the old timers setting fire to the forest up above us. Why? It would open up grazing range for the sheep and for animals that were hunted. And that ended with enclosure and with theft of land grants. And instead you have this fire suppression regime that does something else really nefarious. When you had frequent low intensity fires, it allowed forests in our area here in, especially in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, to get old growth characteristics. So you'd end up with these ponderosas that are like 4 people it takes to hug them right at the base. Why? Because the frequent fires would wipe out the competitors. Now what you have, the corporations, the logging companies will tell you, we have 100 times more trees today than we did in the 1800s. Yes, because you're producing timber plantations. You're not allowing ecosystems to get restored.
Right.
And yet so you have dog hair forests, right? Instead of old growth and late successional complex agroecosystems that are called uneven age management. We have an even age management regime that basically treats trees as a commodity. And for that reason, here in our own watershed, they consider spruce a weed. So it can't be part of the ecosystem. You got to get rid of it. The spruce, the blue spruce doesn't belong here. We want only Doug fir and ponderosa, right? And aspen. Those are the merchantable tree species. And this, you're absolutely right, Reynaldo, reflects the Western-centric a settler colonial bias in how even the science of forest management is framed. But I would disagree with you on this. Chicana and Chicano Studies has had a lot to say about this. There are a lot of us that write environmental history. I could list a dozen people that have produced books and articles that attack this. The problem is we get ignored by the mainstream scholarship, and we get ignored by the New York Times Review of Books, and we get it despite the fact that we're doing really amazing work on all the issues that you named. And so I just want to bring attention to the fact that there is no gap. I mean, maybe in 92, when Laura Pulido and I did our first environmental justice panel at NACCS, 3 people showed up, 1 left. What does this have? That's a white people thing, environmentalism. A lot has changed since then. We're no longer alone, right, in environmental studies, environmental history, environmental ethics, environmental science, and all the rest. But now the other issue I want to respond to, because I think it's really very important, and that is what's the framework in relation to Chicaneki studies, the idea of cultural versus racial differences and all of that. Actually, I've recently started calling humanities the inhumanities. And we talk about arts and sciences, the humanities, and the natural sciences. Is really Monsanto is the natural sciences, Monsanto studies. The humanities are the inhumanities. And what we need to do is recognize, as we should, by getting all our Chicana and Chicano studies students to read people like Renato Rosaldo, who anticipates a lot of the arguments that are made by Linda Twahi Smith in her all very important book, Decolonizing Methodologies. I require all my students to read Renato's stuff on truth and culture. Why? Because of a concept you mentioned earlier, Reynaldo, multiple subjectivities. This is a really important concept. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment because it's a very important issue, and it helps me explain why I'm against identity politics. Okay, but let me put that on the side burner for now because it's a complicated issue. What I want to get to right now is that given the structure of the university curriculum and of the institution as an epistemological and political enterprise, you have the natural sciences, Monsanto Inc., right? Monsanto Bayer et al. And then you have the inhumanities, and then you have the so-called social sciences, which often is social control studies. And what I approach the issue of climate change in Chicana and Chicano studies, I actually do it with disdain for that model. So I ignore whatever's happening in the inhumanities. Well, I don't ignore, but it's not useful to the way I approach the issue of how I teach. I'm interested in subverting STEM. Why is Chicana and Chicano studies not challenging the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math? Why? That's a more profound question. Plenty of us are writing critiques of the humanities, of history, of philosophy. It's all over the place. That's what Chicana and Chicano studies has been. How many of us are doing critical social science studies of science and technology at a time when it's never been more badly needed? This conversation is taking place at the University of Washington because the American Ethnic Studies Department is in a position, because of the people we have, to start teaching critical studies of science and technology to people in the STEM fields. Of course, the danger there, you become a service department to the STEM guys, right? But that's a cost that we may have to be willing to pay because we need to subvert their thinking. And I'm not just talking about ethics, I'm talking about how you do research. What knowledge is. What do you mean by knowledge, right? And I mean, I've got farmers here who know about how beans do nitrogen fixation. They don't ever call it that. Me dice, one of my mentors me decía, me gusta el frijol, Peña, porque le da fuerza a la tierra. That was his understanding of what the Western scientists would call the nitrogen fixing capability of legumes. We have that kind of knowledge. It has been gradually introduced, I think, across universities through various mechanisms, various fields of study. I actually support an agenda that restructures the relationship between Chicana, Chicano, Chicaneke studies and the STEM fields. And that would be a much more subversive, transformative effect in terms of finding scientific allies who are willing to dispense with their Western assumptions, methods, and paradigms, and adopt a more radical approach to the study of things like climate chaos than what we currently have. Because you know what, we're going to need those scientists to collaborate with us if we're to ever really make effective policy change with regard to anything having to do with these challenges that we face. We need a project that just massively distributes information to the colleges of engineering, the colleges of the natural sciences and the like, that are really quite ignorant when it comes to questions, not just of ethics, but of other people's knowledges of how to manage ecosystems. And that's what I've been teaching, as you know, Reynaldo, for years, for decades. I've been teaching traditional environmental knowledge. What local place-based knowledge exists all over the planet is still a very dominant form of not just knowledge, but of subjectivity as well. So I really appreciate your comment, but it leads me to challenge us in a different direction, which is, what about STEM? What's our relationship to the STEM fields? That's really critical. And I think it was a very important lesson. I remember in the early years of the environmental justice movement, that in the early 1990s, when the movement was just really taking hold, and before the first summit, I remember how we were like the Southwest Network for Environmental Economic Justice, SNEEJ, right, led by Richard Moore out of Albuquerque, and how we were teaching people how to do water quality testing, right, and how to do air sampling, and how to understand the science behind it, right? But we were also using oral history to divulge, to celebrate and remember the beauty of what our elders knew about clean air and water and the importance of it, right? So it wasn't enough to just sort of, here's the Western science, learn some methods, but you really want to transform the scientific enterprise based on our own knowledge. Now, with respect to the idea of settler colonialism, because that is an important concept of late, as distinguished from, say, colonialism or internal colonialism, the idea of it being related to extraction and therefore capitalism is only part of the story.
Yeah, sure.
Let me explain what I mean. The work that I think is most important being done on this question is by Native studies scholars like Glenn Coulthard, right, who wrote the book Red Skin, White Masks, on the politics of recognition in Canada. And what I like about Glenn's approach is how he uses marks and the concept of the primitive accumulation, which is central for him in order to understand how the settler colonists dispossessed the Aboriginal people of Canada from their land.
Sure.
And it's a very powerful example, I think, of what can be done with intersectional type of analysis that's informed by the best in Marx. By the way, I don't consider myself a Marxism. I think Marxism is 99% vulgar. And, I read Marx, Das Kapital y the Grundrisse. That's what I go to. I don't like to go to the Marxists for my sources. I'd rather go to the old Moore himself. And that's what Glenn Coulthard does. But I have my disagreement with Glenn that has implications for what you just said. And that is that he says that in the case of Canada, Aboriginals experience the primitive accumulation differently than the European peasantry. And that the reason is that in Europe, they became proletariats, while in Canada, the Aboriginals did not get proletarianized. Actually, that's not true. There are plenty of Aboriginal Canadians working in timber, mining, they're fracking. They're, the same contradictions that you'll find in the Diné, the Navajo Nation, right? Any of the Council of Energy Resource Tribes have these contradictions between, wanting to stay land-based and traditional and then being sucked into the global economy of the fossil fuel or uranium sector, whatever the sector is, whatever extractive sector we're talking about. So this is where you were pointing to the need for a more intersectional approach of looking at race, culture, sex, gender, sexuality, and of course, class, political economy.
Yeah,
And,
I wouldn't call it intersectional. I think that term has become politically tainted in very colored and racial ways that
this brings me
that doesn't serve us as well. I think one needs to go beyond that, because it's tied more to identity politics and scholarship than it is to Chicano and Chicano studies.
well, that's why that brings me to
anyway.
the conversation around identity politics and why I disdain identity politics. But my take is probably different than a lot of other people. I always open up in discussing identity politics with my students with the notion that the original identity politics are the founding principles of this republic of property, which is what it is. It's not a democracy. We live in a republic of property. And the republic of property meant that the first identity politics are white, male, and property owning. And that all identity politics issue forth from the first sin of the slave owning, property owning, toxic masculinity of white men that shape the Constitution and the principles that underlie this republic of property. And so because of that, I sort of like shake my head a little bit when people accuse Mexican origin people, Chicanx people, Black people, Native American playing identity politics, or LGBTQ plus people. We all get accused of playing identity politics. The only reason we're having to struggle for recognition of rights is because of the original sin, because all identity politics are basically a response to white male property owning hegemony. And so the sooner we can dispense with that, the better. Now, what that also means is that because of the history of those identity politics, it has shaped our phenomenological experiences, how we perceive ourselves to be, as Bourdieu and others would argue, being is perception. Perception is being. I actually disagree with that, but it's there. It's an ideological project. It has tainted, to use your term, a lot of discourse and thinking around anything that has to do with difference. And that's actually the category that I prefer in terms of, as opposed to diversity. We're really talking about difference. And difference is a power-knowledge relationship. So there is, I think, a useful contribution there for us in how we teach about this with some elements of Foucault being useful. But what I actually think is the most powerful thing is to focus on our subjectivity. I always think identity politics can lead you into trapdoors, neoliberal or liberal trapdoors, right? And you're already playing, as Emma Perez and others have argued, you're already playing in the master's mirror. You know, you're what's called an enantiomorph. You're a mirroring other because you're asking for recognition as you view yourself in the master's mirror. And a lot of us think that decolonizing and indigenizing our question of who we are, you smash the mirror. You don't talk to the mirror.
That's exactly my point in the responses that I'm saying here. Okay, I mean, it's not a question of disagreeing with the substance. It's a matter of how we present it in relationship, particularly to Chicana and Chicano studies, because it is not being recognized out there, if you will, as a unique perspective. And I think it is a unique perspective. You know, if you compare English colonialism or British colonialism to Spanish colonialism, aside from the time difference and so on, British colonialism was settler colonialism. Why do you have white people dominating the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, etc.? Because they were promoting the settlement of European, primarily Northern Western Europeans. You don't have that in Spanish. One, there weren't that many, and two, they were on the southern part of Europe or the Mediterranean, and there was a distinction there. But the number of people, particularly indigenous people in Mesoamerica, was as much as 25 million. You know, during the entire 400 years of colonialism, you had maybe 350,000 Europeans enter and maybe 300,000 Black Africans enter into Mesoamerica. There was no way that that was going to overwhelm the indigenous population. So we're basically still an indigenous population. On the other hand, when you look at, religion, 90+% of the population of Mexico is considered Christian or Catholic. So the idea of what changes took place during the Spanish colonial period versus the English colonial period, and particularly the perception or the rationale that the British used to take over Indian land, like the Cherokee Nation, which covered 5 or 6 states, and then engage in the invasion of Mexico to take almost 1 million square miles of the northern Mexican territory, was that, they just weren't being productive with the land. They weren't using it. They weren't exploiting it in ways that, could develop, be human development, but they could do it. And so their purpose was, well, then let's just take over the land and be more productive, because the Indians and the Mexicans, can't do it. And you see that in relationship to the U.S.-Mexican War and in relationship to the movement. So I'm not disagreeing with you.
Are you saying that Mexico is not a settler
is,
colony? Are you saying that Mexico is not a settler colony?
Yes, I'm saying.
I would disagree strongly. Look, let me just interject something, because I think you're actually going down a very
but if you're going to say settler colony, it's going to be in relationship to the colonial period.
I'd like to speak to from the point of view of Arizona. Mm-hmm. Since I've been here since '92, and you did mention Devon and your talk about Guadalupe. But it also goes back to here, Arizona, go back to the 750 after Christ, in the sense that right here in Arizona, you had the Hohokam, and they flourished from the 700s to the 1400s, and then all of a sudden there was no water. And then they just left everything. Although the channels that they used to have to deliver water for their agriculture, that's what was used to rebuild Phoenix. Mm-hmm. And then also, because here in Phoenix, now it's the 5th largest city in the country, and it has grown ever since the free trade agreement. And it's expanded because the roads lead to Canada. Mm-hmm. So, and then they lead also to the maquilas. And here you do have toxic barrios. You have urban heat islands, which is what you use the example for Guadalupe. So that, but as you know, also Arizona used to be part of New Mexico, all the way to Yuma, and then from Yuma used to be part of California, so it didn't exist. So there's a need to perhaps develop scholars on around climate justice inside Arizona, or you could extend some of your studies to link them up. That will inspire people, because Arizona is growing. It's about 5 million people in Phoenix itself. And Chicanos, Chicanas, Latinos, there are about 1.5 million just in the city. And of course, Tucson has problems with water. It cannot grow anymore because there's lack of water. And if you go down to southeastern Arizona, same thing. They have problems with water. There's not enough water to grow. And so that sense that it's very important to also develop scholars under climate justice to develop to deal also with Arizona. And we do have here resistance in the form of, there's a group called Chispa, and it's headed by Teo Argueta. I think he's a Guatemalan origin, immigrant, but he's working inside the Chicano community to deal with these problems with toxic barrios and also with urban heat islands. So that, but what can you suggest for a greater development of the climate justice movement inside of Arizona?
I want to thank you all, especially Devon, for your talk, and Reynaldo for responding, and everybody's participation today. I think you point out the deep catastrophic crisis we're in, and as well many ideas for the solidarity and the activism we need to do to resist them. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you at our next podcast. Bye-bye.
Mocto, gracias. Nos vemos. Ñeras y ñeros.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. All right. All right.